Welcome to the Unshakable Hope podcast, where real life intersects redeeming love. I'm Kelly Hall, and this is where we wrestle through faith questions such as how do I trust God's heart when his ways and delays are breaking mine? We'll hear from people just like you and me who have experienced God's faithfulness when life didn't unfold as they expected. My prayer is that God would renew our hope in his word and his love through these conversations. Hey, friends, before we dive in, I just wanted to ask for a quick favor. If you haven't already, would you take just a moment and subscribe or follow this podcast wherever you listen? I can't say I understand the algorithms involved, but this simply makes it easier for others to discover this podcast and be encouraged by the message. Thank you. I really appreciate your help. Today, I am so glad you're here for what I believe will be a really encouraging conversation. My guest today, Sarah Frazer, is no stranger to disillusionment and heartache. She is an author, a Bible study mentor, a wife, and a mother of 5. She's someone who served in foreign mission fields, and she's written a book that I believe many of us can probably relate to. It's called I Didn't Sign Up for This, and the subtitle is How to Rest in God's Goodness When Your Story Shifts. Sarah, I am so thankful we finally been able to get our schedules to mesh. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Kelly, for having me. I love the theme of your podcast and your heart with this message. We were talking before, and I think everybody at one point in their life comes to the point where they just feel really disillusioned with the circumstances that they find themselves in, whether by their own choices, but really, I think the choices of other people or just circumstances of life. And it's really important that we have these conversations to remind ourselves of what is true. So I just commend you for having such an honest and open conversations with people about this topic. So I'm honored to be here. Thank you.
Oh, Sarah, thank you. Thank you so much. I'd like for you to kick us off by telling us about your beautiful family so we can know who you are a little bit before we dive into other parts of the conversation. But I'm wondering if you can add also something you do that refreshes your soul when you get weary, as I imagine you do sometimes.
Oh, yes, definitely. So I will explain our family and then I will explain what I do to refresh because when you hear our family, you might think, oh, that's a lot. But my husband and I will have been married for 19 years this year.
Oh,
We have 5 children. 3 are biological and 2 we have adopted from China. So we adopted our daughter in 2000. No, she came home in 2015 and our son came home in 2017.
mm,
And so a lot of people ask if they're related. Yes, they're brother and sister, but not biologically. So, yes, they are related, but they are not biological, and they are 2 different, very different people, as all of each of my children are very unique. But our oldest is 16 and our youngest, he is 9. Our first daughter, the first child we adopted from China, she's 11 and she has special needs. And so
mm.
I talk a lot about the story of her coming home to us in my book. And we were told that her special needs were very minor, very easy, a little bit of therapy and love, I think was the phrase we were given, and she would probably be okay.
Mm.
We were handed a very different child. And in the middle of China, I just remember thinking, did they have a mix up or what? And so
Wow.
her special needs were much more severe. And then we've been walking this special need parenting journey for the past 9 years, and it's been a journey. And the Lord has taught me a lot about myself and a lot about who He is. Having children in a wide span of age can be challenging. Adding special needs to that just kind of adds that extra layer. And that's where the title of the book came from. I remember sitting in China and really just telling God that I signed up for adoption, but I didn't sign up for this.
Mm.
And I specifically didn't want this. I had told God that this wasn't what I wanted. And I believe that, he ignored my prayer. And
That must feel
so
so hurtful.
it I think before this happened, I would have never used these words, but I did feel betrayed by God.
Yeah.
And I had to wrestle with that. And I think that's an honest feeling that we
Mm,
can take to him. I would have been afraid before this happened in my life to say those words, God, I feel like you betrayed me.
yeah.
But I think that was a turning point for me to enter in to a deeper intimacy with him.
Wow.
Yeah, those are the words when we're honest that really lead to intimacy.
Absolutely. I so agree. And I agree with the struggle of actually voicing that. But that was how I felt too on the day my oldest daughter was diagnosed. I felt betrayed by God. And I said, weren't you paying attention? I just really felt like God had abandoned us, left us, turned his back on us. And it was so healing and it certainly did lead me into deeper intimacy with the Lord because he spoke to those deepest wounds in my heart and those deepest questions.
Yes, and I think that prior to that, I treated God as sort of this far off being that loved me in an intellectual way, but I did not experience that kind of love until I was able to say, "This is how I really feel about you." And
Yeah.
I distinctly remember in my spirit feeling him say, "That's okay. I'm big enough to take it."
Mm.
And immediately my mind went to at that time, I had a 6, a 4, and a 2-year-old. Biologically, and we adopted a 2-year-old. And I remember my 6-year-old is very vocal, and he would just tell me what he thought about everything all the time. I remember when he was a little younger, a toddler, and I wouldn't let him do something, and he just said, "I just hate you right now." And at the time, you're looking at this little 2-year-old and you're like, "That's okay. That's okay. Like, I'm an adult. I know what's best for you." And when I told God that I was felt really betrayed by you, I felt like he was saying as a father, "That's okay. I can take it. I know what's
Mm.
best for you."
Wow.
And to me, that was just I know it was his spirit because that was not what I was expecting, or that was
Right.
no way I came up with that.
Uh,
That was a big turning point when I shifted from trying to feel like I had it all together and I was trusting God and all of that, when inside I was really angry and really upset with what he had allowed in our family. And so just voicing that to him was so and I just want to give anybody permission to say you can voice that to God. It's okay. He's big enough. He's
yeah.
big enough.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's so freeing. I love that God also gave you that moment with your 2-year-old to see the truth of your
Yeah.
relationship with God.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I know in all of this, you are so busy and your husband is a physician
That's
and
right. Yeah.
and so
How
what
do
do
I
you
refresh?
yeah, how do you refresh?
Yes. So I think I'm going to answer it two ways. Like, there are seasons, even during the year or even during my life, where I've done different things. And seasons of the year right now is we have a pool that's local to our community. And I love just taking the kids to the pool this year. This is the first year I feel like everybody's like, okay, I can actually close my eyes or lean back and no one's gonna
Yeah, they're
drown or
safe.
anything. Like,
Yeah.
everybody knows how to swim, there's lifeguards. I put my daughter, like, right in front of me, I'm like, "This is the section of the pool you can play in, and this is where I'll be," and I can just sit back and relax. So refreshing for me to do
Mm,
that. Another thing that I really like in this season is my back porch, and if you know me on Instagram, I've been sharing a little bit about how much I love just kind of doing a very mild redo of our back porch, and it's so peaceful and quiet out there, and I
mm.
can go out there and be by myself, and that to me has been a very nice, refreshing thing. So, I'm very much a be by myself to
Yeah,
refresh
yeah.
person. I am very much an introvert in a lot of ways, and so if I'm by myself, that just anywhere, I'm just refreshed.
Oh, I love that. I'm an introvert as well. And so both of us are introverts doing extroverting things, right?
We do, yes. I am an occasional extrovert when time calls for me to.
Right, me too. And I love speaking to women, and so it doesn't seem to really mesh with being an introvert, but I do recharge by being alone. Well, you have talked a lot in your book about wrestling and soul healing, and even this morning, and I'm so grateful because this is what we talk about on this show. I love being
Mhm.
able to hand listeners real life stories of how to wrestle through those places where your dreams have died. And you've experienced the truth that the death of any dream brings profound grief, and you've got to grieve it. You've learned the necessity of grieving, and so I would like for you to talk just a little bit more, if you can, about how God walked you through a deeper process of grieving. Initially, you discovered telling God the truth. You found the freedom to say, I feel like you betrayed me. But how did he take you even deeper? Because as her story unfolds, there was a lot more to grieve.
Yeah. With our daughter, I think I've had to grieve that initial sort of what I thought my immediate future would look like,
Yeah.
bringing her home. And then I also had to grieve what my own future would look like. When you have young children, you're in the thick of it. And you can't imagine what it would be like to not have them in your home, but you know that day is coming, right? Eventually, they're all going to fly away and be on their
Yeah.
own.
Yeah.
And with our daughter, I tell people now, I still don't know what that will look like for her.
Right.
Like,
Right.
we work towards independence, but I still don't know. But I tell you, getting to that point in my own life to say it might never be just my husband and I,
Yeah.
like that may never happen was something I had to grieve and realize that I'm not in control of that, whether that happens or not. I can't predict that. And one of the ways that really helped me sort of walk through those initial, I would say, few months or
Yeah.
even that first year was living one day at a time.
Mm.
I had to stop thinking about the future.
Yeah.
And I am a planner. I have lists. I have 5-year goals, I have 1-year goals, I have 10-year goals, and I had to throw all of that out the window for a season. I
Mm.
had to say, I don't know what tomorrow is gonna come. I don't know what next week is gonna look like. We didn't know if she would ever talk. We didn't know if she would ever walk. We didn't know if she would ever feed herself. She was very malnourished. She was very weak, and it was almost like being handed a newborn. And so I was just in the very deep throes of grief. And so I started just saying, what do I need for today? Well, let's just focus on today. What do my other children need? What does she need? What do I need for today? Another thing that I did was I kept reading my Bible, and
Yeah.
I didn't want to. The desire was not there. In fact, I probably had more of a desire not to read it because I felt so hurt, and
Yeah.
it wasn't bringing the comfort that it normally bring me. And so I began reading, and I tell you why I kept reading was because I had about a few years before that, I had started my Bible study in my home with some friends. And there's about 4 or 5 of them, and we would meet every other Thursday, and we continue to meet through this whole year. I was able to open up to them, I was able to receive encouragement, but also I was leading it. So I had to do the Bible lessons. We were
Yeah.
going through different Bible studies, and so I had to read my lesson, I had to do the homework. I had to prepare how I was gonna lead the discussion. And
Yeah.
so it forced me to read the Bible in spite of my feelings.
Wow.
And I think that was so powerful. I felt like a hypocrite. I will admit, I felt like a hypocrite because I wasn't feeling anything.
Mm.
And I was actually really like not getting much out of it emotionally. But I read a book once and they were talking about depression, and the author was saying, you do these things, pray, go to church, read your Bible, even though you don't feel like doing it, even he goes, and it's not being hypocritical, it's actually building those faith muscles. And you might not see those instant results, but it will build and build and build. And it's actually the brave thing to do,
It
but
is.
the courageous thing to do,
Yeah.
and it is the thing that actually God is gonna use in your life. So, he does not look at us and say, "Well, you don't really have the right heart attitude to be reading the Bible today." Well, you know what? That's why I'm reading it, because I don't have the right heart attitude. So he's not sitting up there as a judge on heaven's throne saying, "Oh, you need to get yourself together before you come to me." No, he says, "Hey, you're weary, you're weak, that's who needs to come to me."
Yeah.
So that was so freeing for me to realize that I did not need to judge myself on my feelings.
Yeah, I
That's
gotta
something.
tell you, I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, go.
I gotta tell you that I remember saying the most courageous people I know are those who continue to press in and lean into God even when they don't feel like it, because they're living the truth that God's word is true, even when they're not seeing evidence in their life, but they know in their heart it's true. And so that's a faith hero to me. That's what it looks like. You're leaning in and pressing in. You are right. It takes a lot of courage to keep doing that when you're not feeling it. And also, the thing I love about your story is that I've heard from so many people, and I'm one of them, who has been encouraged when they hear words coming out of their mouth, like they're being encouraged by the truth they're speaking to other people. And they wouldn't have spoken it had they not been in this group of people or been in this situation. So
Yeah.
I love the way God encouraged you during that time.
Yeah, and all of that, and that's why I look back and I see I had the habit of reading my Bible. I had decided back when my 2 oldest boys were really little, I need to read the Bible every day. Like, it was a necessity. I was longing for it. I had that deep longing for it, and so I got in such a habit of reading it every day that when I didn't want to, it was still, like, just a habit in my brain to do. And then 2, so God planted that
Mhm.
before I faced the suffering.
I love that.
Then he planted me to start this Bible study 2 or 3 years before this. So he knew ahead of time what was gonna happen, and he placed those things in my path when that became a realization in my life that God actually has orchestrated a lifeline in the middle of what felt like me drowning. To be already there waiting for me was so powerful
Yeah.
because that feeling of abandonment or betrayal, it just kind of got washed away
Yeah.
because I realized, "Oh, wait, you knew this was gonna happen and you orchestrated so I would not go under the waves."
Yeah.
And I just see that as God's incredible goodness, and that's what I talk about in the book a lot is just God's goodness is the answer to our suffering, and
Yes.
looking for those things that we can say in our life, "This is good and this is from God."
That's so powerful. That's a great comfort to me as well, that the Lord himself goes before us and he never
Yes.
leaves us or forsakes us. So we don't have to be afraid or discouraged. It was helpful for me to see my life in this eternal timeline kind of space and know God lives outside of that. Because as I looked back, I could see, as you saw, how he prepared me for what was going to happen
Yeah.
and how he prepared the way every step of the way along the
Yes.
journey.
Yes.
We saw his
He
goodness.
does. Yes, and one of the things that I've seen even more recently is because I feel like I'm still living the message, I'm still walking this journey, and a little bit of more about our story is my husband and I served as missionaries for 2.5 years in Central America, but we moved in January of 2020. And so, if you
Wow.
remember January of 2020, no one knew what was coming. There was rumors of something, but that
Yeah.
wasn't gonna affect us, right? And so, we were there 2.5 months and the entire country shut down, our ministry shut down, everything. We were in our house for about 6 to 9 months. And the restrictions, they were pretty severe. It was interesting because I felt so much similarities to how it felt to bring our daughter home. that sort of like, we signed up for this, but we didn't sign up for this part of it, you know?
Yeah.
And that's how we felt moving down. We're like, hey, we signed up to serve you on the mission field, but we didn't really sign up for a worldwide pandemic. I questioned God, why did we move in January? Why couldn't we have spent it back in the States? We weren't being useful there. Like, what was the point of us being down there if we're not being useful, if we're not even attending church?
Yeah.
It was such a good reminder to look back on our daughter's adoption and that whole process because it had been 5 years at that point. And we just realized God's got a plan. Like, He's got a plan. And I felt like if we hadn't had what happened with our daughter, we would have handled that so differently.
Mm.
We would have struggled with similar things of God, where are you? What are you doing? All of these things. And then the Lord, I guess I don't learn my lessons or I need like repeat lessons or something. So then the Lord removed us from the mission field very unexpectedly and in a very hurtful way.
So sorry.
After 2.5 years, we found ourselves without any money, without a job, without a home. We ended up living with my parents for 4 months, and
Wow.
we were just devastated. If I felt like with my daughter that a dream died, it was, the dream for her and the dream for me and that sort of thing. But the dream to be a missionary was something that we had talked about since before we were even married. And
Mm.
so this was a dream that we had been working towards for years and years. We had sold everything. And when we came back, because of the way it was handled, we had to leave about three-fourths of everything that we owned.
Wow.
We had 24 suitcases or bags or boxes or whatever, and that was our life in 24. And I just remember feeling all those feelings again of, "God, are you still there? Like, did you look away? Did you just kind of abandon us?" And we didn't do it was just the organization, and it would have been inevitable, and we see now it would have been inevitable anyway, but just the shock of it was just so jarring. And then just dealing with the death of that dream
Yeah.
has actually been one of the hardest things my husband and I have ever walked through, and that was it'll be 2 years this next month, and it still is something that we're processing, and we're still healing from that, and we do not know what our future is. We do not know where God is gonna lead us. When we came back, we didn't have a plan B.
Mm.
And we still don't really have a plan A or B at this point. I told my husband, instead of taking one day at a time, we're just taking it 1 year at a time. We're just like, okay, this is what we'll do for a year. And that has been an immensely strange process for me to kind of live out this death of a dream.
Yeah.
Yeah, like on a bigger scale, but also relinquishing those plans. That really has been something the Lord has really been teaching me lately is that He has a plan and it's good and I can trust it, but I might not see it or know it at this point. And that's really hard.
Absolutely. Wow, I can so relate. The stories you're telling about these deep surrenders, those are intense and they require so much healing. Those are great losses with layers and layers of complexity. And so I completely understand why you are still processing that with your husband and you're
Yes.
having to sort that out with the Lord. But one of the things that is so apparent as you tell your story is that the list maker has become a risk taker because you are now placing your life in the hands of God when you don't know what's around the next corner. And it's really beautiful to hear, Sarah.
Well, and it's funny that you would say it's risky because as a planner person, it does feel risky.
Yeah.
It feels very vulnerable.
Yes.
But because of these other things that God has, like, He's already walked with us through these other things, I can say, who better to place my hope and faith in my future in
Yeah.
than the God who is in complete control and also is 100% always good.
Yeah.
And I just always go back that the circumstances may not be good, like
Mm.
flat out not good circumstances, but God Himself and His character, that doesn't change. And
Never
that
changes.
and that is a comforting thing when I feel myself, and I don't always have this confident feeling in the future all that I don't wake up every morning feeling that, but on the mornings that I feel anxious or I feel worried or I feel like we need to have a plan or something like that, just going to scripture and saying, "Okay, what do I know to be true?
Yes.
What do I know to be true?" And what I go back to is His goodness. And
Yep.
so that is such a comfort to me.
Such a comfort. It's so deep, it's so meaningful. And so now you're taking God at his word.
Yes.
Let's just play this out. The list maker became a risk taker who now takes God at his word. And you're living in a deeper place of surrender.
Mhm. And I wanna encourage people who might not be this far in their journey, maybe they're more in the part where it's just really difficult to trust because you feel that, like, "Well, I trusted God and this is what happened." I wanna encourage you that this is a journey that you don't arrive at. This is something that you might wrestle with your whole life.
Yeah.
And it's okay no matter what part of that journey that you're in. And it's okay that you might have some good days, like I said, and some not so good days where you do kind of have those doubts. And so don't feel like you have to arrive at a certain point. I don't feel like I've arrived at a point and I don't have to worry about this anymore. No, like
Right.
this is a daily thing
Yeah.
and everything you said is true and I do take God at his word, but it's a choice I make on a very daily basis.
And
So,
sometimes an hour by hour
yes.
basis. I mean, we understand. I think that came across as you
Oh,
explained
good.
your story. I want to get to this beautiful way you described fear. So I think it's fun how the creative ways that God helps people walk out their faith when they're afraid. But you write something that I just thought it was a beautiful connection you make. You say you used to believe that faith replaced fear, but you discovered, and this is what you write, faith and fear can stand side by side. Faith can hold fear's hand and tell her, it'll be okay. God is in the middle of our fears with the faith we need to stay afloat. That's so meaningful. I love how you composed that and described what was going on in your heart.
What's so interesting is I always thought doubt was the opposite of faith,
Yeah.
but the Bible says that fear is actually what we feel when we don't have faith. And so I imagine two girls standing on the side of a pool and just holding hands, and one of them is really afraid and the other one is super brave. And they're the same person. Like, I feel like I'm both of those people, and
Mm,
they're holding hands, and they'll say, "We'll jump into this hard situation, and we'll be okay."
wow.
And what really helped me with that was something really tangible and simple. When we first brought our daughter home, my mother bought me a little plaque, and it said, "I'm going to choose or have courage every day." I sat that above my sink while I washed my dishes, and I read that every day, and I said, "Okay, I'm gonna be courageous today. Like, I'm gonna have faith," and I think that's where our courage comes from, not something we muster up. It's
Right.
something we're having our faith. It was okay if I felt afraid. I gave myself permission to be really afraid. What was my future going to be like? What was it going to be like with my daughter? Did she have a disease that would eventually, be so degenerative that she would just lay in bed? Or would she have this? Or would she have that? And I said, it's okay to feel those feelings, but I'm going to let faith jump in first, and I'm going to let faith take over and say, we can do today. And I think that reminder of just having courage daily was just something super tangible for me to look at and read that really helped me in that season.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I love that image that you have. The two little girls standing beside the pool, but they're both you.
Yeah.
So good. Well, I also really liked the way you paralleled your story with Moses as you unfolded everything. And I have felt that a lot of my story parallels parts of Moses too, especially the 40 years in the wilderness. So, like,
Yeah.
really, I feel like I'm on the shelf, hidden, and life has been interrupted. But really, that's not what was happening. There were beautiful ways God was ministering to Moses in those 40 years before he called him at the age of 80 to go deliver the Israelites. And so it's an interesting perspective about a timeline that really helps comfort me. So I would love for you just to talk about how that story ministers to you and how I think specifically in your book, you talked about how it helped you with feelings of insignificance, but you can talk about it in any way you want.
I always sort of connect that idea of the wilderness to those seasons in our life where we feel forgotten,
Yeah.
or the seasons in our life where we're suffering and maybe people aren't aware. Or if they are, it's not right in their face. What for me with my daughter, I think what was hard is people would comment on how much progress she was making. And it would be like, wow, this aren't you so excited about this progress and this progress? But during that time, I really struggled with that she hadn't caught up. Like, I really was hoping that she would be that normal, and when it became more and more obvious that she would never fit those normal milestones,
Mm.
I really was discouraged, and that felt like it was a hidden suffering
Yeah.
because I didn't want to tell people when everyone else was saying, "She's making progress and she's doing so great," and I was thinking this isn't really, where I thought I would be or where she would be, and I'm really discouraged about this, and it felt like a wilderness for me. And
Yeah.
then I also, after my second born, 4 months after, my grandmother passed away, and I was very close to her, and I was already postpartum, and then I went into deep depression, and I told no one. I mean, my husband was the only one who knew, and I
Oh,
struggled for many months, and I just put on the face, and I went to church, and I did my Bible study and all this other stuff, and it felt like this wilderness feeling, and I think that's a whole other topic when we talk about depression and that
mhm.
stigma and all of that, but I
Yeah.
think that that felt like a wilderness season for me, but it ended up being a season where God drew near and he was my light and my salvation. And it
Yeah.
was then that I started reading my Bible because it was like out of like desperation. I needed that light in my life. And so I look at those wilderness seasons and I see what God grew in those seasons,
Yeah.
and I liken it like a seed in the ground because we plant a seed and it actually grows drastically in the dark.
Oh, good
And
point.
and I felt like that little seed when I was struggling with depression and anxiety and all of that, and I felt like, "What can grow during this season?" And the Lord just gave me that image. My husband's a huge garden lover, plant, he loves all that. I have a horrible green thumb, but he loves gardening, and he told me one day that a thunderstorm actually helps your garden grow because of the electricity in the air, and it enriches the soil, and actually thunderstorms are really good for gardens. And I thought, is that not a metaphor for our life? Those storms that we face are actually enriching the soil where God is going to grow something. And for a long time, that seed is under the ground and no one sees the growth, right? You
Right.
don't see it at all. And when it comes up, it's really tiny growth. It doesn't look like a tomato plant. It doesn't look like a pepper plant. It's just one little leaf out of the ground. And that was such a reminder for me that I don't have to have this flourishing faith all of the time. That maybe God is growing something in the wilderness season where no one's watching, or in the dark under the soil where one day we're going to see the fruit of this. Like this podcast for you,
Yeah.
God through you in that wilderness season, and now you're able to see the fruit of all of that growth that was happening underneath of it all. And so
Absolutely.
I just that is such an encouragement to me. Even just, knowing your story and hearing your podcast, I just know that that can be true in everybody's life.
Absolutely. That is such a comfort when we're in those places where we feel hidden, that there's something beautiful happening. I love that story of the storm and the plant.
Yeah. My husband is a chemistry major, and so he was telling me all the chemistry things about it, and I'm like, "I just like the spiritual analogy to this," and he laughed at me, and he said, "I never connected that," and it was just always a chemistry thing, but it was to me a very spiritual lesson, so
Yeah, I don't need all the chemistry, but
no, I don't need to know how it works, it's just really neat that it works, right?
yes. I'm wondering about impossible situations. Just the fact that when we know nothing is impossible with God, because you and I both, we've lived in places where our circumstances tell us this is impossible. You might as well give up, check out, turn around, go back, climb under your covers and hide. So, how do you deal with those moments? What have you learned along the way that anchors you?
Definitely, it's funny. You said you're a physical therapist, and there was a physical therapist that came into our home when we first brought our daughter home to provide services. I think I was just lamenting the frustration of she's not where she needs to be and how
Yeah.
long before she gets, meets these. It felt like I was standing in front of an immovable rock. I mean, she was having feeding issues and she couldn't hold her head up and she was barely crawling and all this stuff, and I just thought, "This is impossible." Like, I have no idea what I'm doing. I wasn't prepared for this. There's
Yeah.
no book that I can read to help me with this, and so I looked at the therapist, and I was probably saying something like that. She said, "Hey, what does she need to learn next?" She goes, "Let's just focus on what's the next step," and it was interesting because I really wanted her potty trained. I said, "I'd really like her to be potty trained." And she goes, "Okay, to be able to do that, she has to be able to put her pants up and down." And she couldn't do that at that point. And so she's like, "Let's work on that. That'll be our goal. Let's just take this one little step at a time." And I thought, that's the key.
Yeah.
Like, that's the key. Let's not look at how to move this huge rock and get to where we wanna be. Let's just say, "I wanna sleep at night." Let's just say, "How can I get more rest in my day?" Or, "How can I feel less anxious?" Or, "What can I take out of my life that is unnecessary?" Or not necessary right now. I think we feel really overwhelmed with our circumstances and it just seems impossible. And maybe because my husband's a physician, I've been able to listen to him explain how he cares for patients that have sort of big medical things. And he says, we don't go in and just perform surgery right away. Like, we check your heart or we check your lungs and we make sure if that's not working, we work on that little piece and we work on this little piece and then, we might go in and do surgery, but it's almost like we want the big fix right away. We just want to fix everything and
Yeah.
God definitely I think he definitely can do that. I definitely have seen him move mountains and move big
Sure.
rocks out of the way, but I think his regular mode of operation is that sort of slow path forward. And so just focusing on what is the next step that I can take. That, like I said, that plays into that just daily choice that we make.
Yeah.
And so that has been an encouragement to me. That therapist, she has no idea what an encouragement that was to me and how I've continued that mindset with my daughter all these 9 years that we've had her.
Mm.
And when the therapists come out and say, "Okay, what are your goals for this quarter?" or whatever, I think we need to learn to pour into a cup. And I've started to do really small things, right? Like, we need
Yeah.
to be able to write our name. I just keep it really small and keep those goals just moving slowly forward instead of the big thing.
Gosh, that's a very helpful strategy. Just take it down to a bite-sized portion. I
Mm.
love it. So I wanted to just close with one other question, just as a
Uh-huh.
mama, one mama to another, and for our listeners, I know your daughter is nonverbal and
Mhm.
she's smart and she can hear everything that's being said. But how do you deal with the issue of her faith as a mama in this season?
So this is something that I have really wrestled with the past maybe 2 or 3 years because she's starting to understand the Bible and she can answer questions. And about a year ago, I can't remember if it was a VBS or just a Sunday morning or Wednesday night or something, a leader came up and said she got saved. And I felt really guilty for being like, "Okay, that's nice." I don't know if she really grasped it or not, but I thought, "You know what? I am not going to assume that she doesn't understand.
Yeah.
I'm gonna assume that she does, and I'm gonna look at heart evidence and that fruit that comes from salvation, and it and I have to remind myself of this, it might look different than what we might think fruit
Absolutely.
of the Spirit looks like. But I'm not gonna assume. I just don't like it when people assume that she's not smart. Like,
Yeah.
that she has some kind of intellectual disability, and she really doesn't. She's behind, but she's not stuck. And so she is very smart and she understands what people say. And so I thought if I want other people to treat her that way, I'm going to treat her that way in this idea of faith. And so I talked to her. And so we've talked about sin and we've talked about Jesus on the cross. And so one of the things that I've emphasized with her is that God can hear her thoughts.
Mm.
And she's nonverbal, so she can't pray out loud, she
Yeah.
can't verbalize sort of prayer, and so I really encouraged her to pray in her head, and I said, "When you think things in your head, when you think sentences or those sort of things," I said, "God not only hears you, but He understands you." And I kind of encourage her to pray to God, to ask forgiveness or ask God to help you in this situation, just like I would all my other children. And
Yeah.
just encourage her that God hears her and understands. And as a mother, I have to trust that actually God sees her whole being and he understands her more than I do.
Yeah.
And I think that she has faith. I think
Mhm.
that it is very childlike, and I think that is very simple, but according to the Bible, that's the kind of faith we need to have. I pray that the Lord work in her life, but I also have had to trust that God sees her heart,
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
basically,
Yeah.
and I trust that he loves her with so much love, and I really just want her to grow in her faith in God and realize that He loves her and He knows her more intimately than any of us could. And so, like I said, that's my prayer for all my children.
God knows how to speak to us in a way we can hear him. That has been one of the greatest comforts of my life because our girls are deaf. And there was a lot about faith that was communicated that they perceived very differently, that it was more like rules and legalism rather than lots of grace and love. That's God's heart. God's heart is one of
Yes.
love.
Mhm.
She's his kid. And I love that he sees her heart and he knows how to speak to her. I can just imagine the sweet, intimate conversations they have in her mind.
Yes. And I believe that physically, she's physically unable to speak, and that in heaven, oh gosh, I'll hear her voice. And
Oh,
so I hang on to that sort of thought and that hope. Another aspect is the adoption, and that's another layer of processing that I think she hasn't really like dealt with. But our son, he's 9 and he's very verbal. He makes up for her. And so he tells us everything and all the time. And he is starting to process a little bit of the loss that is there. And so, what my desire for both of them is that they will run to God and realize that He knows their full history. He
Mm.
sees their birth family. He was there, because my 2 children will listen to me tell the story of my 3 biological the day they were born, right? We tell those
Mm.
stories.
Yeah.
And my youngest has picked up that I wasn't there when he was born. Like, it's starting to connect in his mind.
Wow.
And I told him he was kind of upset one day, and I said, "You know who was there?" I said, "God was there.
Mm.
And when you get to heaven, you can ask him what that day was like."
Oh, that's so sweet.
And that to me is what I hope for her, that she realizes that God is the piece of her heart that she's missing, if she
Mm.
feels that missing piece. And so that is where I pray for the faith of my daughter. And
Yeah, in those wounded places that she can't express to you.
right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I pray the Lord feels those needs and heals her in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's so beautiful. Well, Sarah, before we close, I just want to mention to all our listeners that we would love for you to connect with Sarah at sarahefraser.com. She has a lot of resources to help you in reading the Bible and connecting with God's heart. Also, you can check out her book there, which I highly recommend. And I'll also put links to all these things in the show notes. Sarah, thank you so much for this time. This conversation was so encouraging and profound.
Thank you so much, Kelly. This was such an honor, and I really appreciate what you're doing here.
Thank you. If you were encouraged in your faith today, it'd be great if you'd help get the word out by subscribing, sharing with a friend, or leaving a review. I'd love to hear from you. You can reach out through my website, kellyhall.org, and pick up some free resources while you're there. Thanks for listening to the Unshakable Hope Podcast.